Okay, so first of all, let's have a look at Clarice. I will explain the basic navigation and use of the controls in Clarice, but I will not go into too much depth. I'm expecting any viewers to maybe have done a little bit of research into Clarice themselves already, but I will go through all of the basics so that no one is too lost, and I hope that I can explain a lot of the things that confused me when I was learning Clarice and a lot of the pitfalls that any user should avoid. So, first of all, simple controls. We can rotate around and pan and zoom in using our left and right mouse buttons and the use of the key Alt on our keyboard. Furthermore, if we say create a cube, we can click F to focus on it, and just like in Maya or other softwares, we use the W, E, and R keys on the keyboard to go through translation, size, or translation, rotation, and size, or we can click the buttons here to access these same controls. So it is very similar to other 3D softwares that you would find out there. Nothing really new or exciting in that regard. The way the layout in Clarice works of the entire project is very much like a layout of a file or a folder structure that you would get on your computer. So for example here, I can right click, go to New, Context, and this creates a folder. So let's call this one Geo for geometry. And in order to rename, you just click F2 or click your right mouse button and click rename here. And so we can access this folder, and you can see this works exactly the same way as any sort of folder hierarchy you would get on Windows or Linux or Macintosh. So I can go into this geometry folder, and here either click New to create geometry or a camera or a light, or I can do it up here. But I would recommend doing it here. This, I would say, is a quicker, better way for most things. So first of all, let's create a box. So we have our box, and you can, for example, right-click an object and then click Contextualize, and it will put this object into its own box, or into its own folder, So let's create another one called Geometry Sphere, and let's contextualize this as well. So if I go and make this slightly larger for the example, we have these two objects, and they are both visible on the screen right now. But one thing you gotta watch out for when you open Clarice is this. This shows you what you are currently viewing within your viewport. So currently, I have selected my entire scene, which is my whole project. So I'm viewing every object within the project itself. However, I can change this to just say object. So whatever object I now select is the only thing viewed within this 3D view. If I go into sphere and select sphere, it is just the sphere that is visible. I can also, for example, select context, and this will show within the 3D view whatever folder I have selected. So if I select Geo, I have both. And this is something that is important to look out for. This will allow you to, for example, only view certain objects whenever you want that, or disabling certain objects whenever they're in the way, that kind of thing. Another important thing to learn when first exploring Clarice is that it has different ways to view what you have in your project. So here we have the browser view, and it just shows us the folders in a tree here, and then whatever is within that folder here. But we can change that to having a hierarchy view, and this simply shows us all of the objects that we have within all of the folders, but not the folders themselves. This is sometimes good because, say for example, if I want to select the actual object sphere and I want to select the box, there's no way for me to do so without exiting their folders. But in hierarchy view, I can select both just like this. There is also the Explorer view, which works similarly to the browser, but you get everything just within this one tree. And again, it's just sort of personal preference and advantages and disadvantages of all of them, and just working with whatever works best for you. So other than that, we can also search. So here I can, for example, type in box, and it will find any objects that are named box or have the word box within their name in the project, and I can select them that way. Okay, so let's actually create a little project just to show how Clarice works and how to set up your whole project in an efficient way that will be easy to use later, and how to get everything working, because it can be confusing trying to get your first render in Clarice because it does work slightly differently than a lot of other software packages. So, in the geometry context, I'm going to go into the sphere. I'm going to move it here and put the box here. I'm going to select to view the whole scene. So now I see both objects, and also let's create a ground. So let's go into geometry, polymesh, polygrid, and we enlarge it. And let's put these two on top. So now I have my geometry. Next thing, what else do I want to create? Well, I also want to create a new context for lights. So in lights, let's create a new light, physical, and here we have the lights that we should be using. Let's not use legacy. Physical works a lot better nowadays. Let's create a distant light. Let me enlarge it just so the arrows are more visible, and this works very much like a directional light in Maya for those who are Maya users. So let's just point it this way and put it here. So now we have geometry and lights. What we also need to create is a new, let's do this in our main project folder in the scene, new render ray tracer. And this will actually allow us to render our image, because unlike in other software packages, you have to create this physically yourself, and you can have several different ones for different layers, and we'll go into that a little bit later, but not now. So also, let's create a new and image, and this will serve as our actual render. So let's rename this render. In the image, if you look, we have this thing called layer editor, and this works very much like the layers in, say, Photoshop. And so what we can do is click this button and create a new 3D layer, and picture this sort of like the layer editor being an image editor, and into it you bring in a layer that is your 3D render pass from Clarice itself. So it's very easy once you wrap your head around it, and here I'm going to explain the controls and the settings in layer 3D that will allow you to utilize this. So in layer 3D we want to scroll down a bit, and here we have a selection for active camera. So let's create a camera. One easy way to do it is, again, let's go back to the main scene view. I can just position the camera within the 3D space in viewport, and just click this button and it'll create a camera for me. This icon signifies that I'm looking through this camera. If I move it, the camera moves. Here we can see the camera's translation and rotation change as I move it. So let's put it here. And in layer 3D, let's again go to camera and plug in our camera. If we select render, we plug in our ray tracer. Now, what else do we need? We need to plug in our lights, geometry, shadows, ray tracing, and global illumination. So in order to do that, let's create groups for our lights and geometries. So for example here, I could take this distant light and I could just plug it into here in lights. However, there is a better way. What we can do is create a new group, and let's call this lights GRP group. And in this light group, I can put in my distant light. So here in inclusion items, let's click add and select distant and apply. So now my distant light is in the light group. So let's go back to the layer 3D, click on that, and go into lights, and let's select lights group. And the advantage of this is that I'm able to say I have more than one light. I have 10 lights. I'm able to add all of these in here and plug them all in into my layer 3D. So let's do a similar thing for geometry. Let's add new group and let's call it geo all group. And here we can do something different. We could include them just this way by selecting the objects, but there is a different way that we could do this. For example, let's just rename these to geo and sphere underscore geo. So we have good convention for the naming of these. And here, go to geo all group and let's create an inclusion rule. What this is, if I click here, what this is an ability for me to create a rule in order to add a lot of geometries to this group. So instead of manually adding them one by one, I can define criteria. So for example here, I've called these underscore geo, both of them. So I can utilize that as a rule for the inclusion into this group. If I click here and click star, star means anything. So at the minute, this rule can basically mean anything, and if I just leave it like this, it doesn't do much. But say I do anything and then include the little underscore geo tag that I created, and just click that and apply. Then if I scroll down, in my group I now have both of my geometries added because they have this underscore geo. If I were to change this to something that is misspelled and apply, you can see they disappear. So underscore geo. Apply. Okay, so now I have my geometry group, which by rule contains both of these geometries. And also, if I now change polygrid to underscore geo, let's call it ground instead, and go into here, you can see that it is now included in the geometry group as well. So in the layer 3D, let's go down to here, and in geometries, let's include geo all group. In the shadows as well, geo all group, and we want the ray tracing to occur on these two, and for global illumination as well. Right. So now how do we see this image? Well, we can create a new window and have that be our render window. So we can either do this through Windows New Queries, and this allows us to create a new window, and here we can click plus and select image view. But for now, let's do it a different way. We can click here to divide this window, and here I can do the same thing as with a floating window and click on image view. And this will show whatever image you have selected, so we're seeing our actual render. So the next question is, how do we add materials to our objects? Well, let's create a new folder, again, in the interest of keeping this tidy, called materials. And in the materials folder, let's create a new material physical standard. And this will give us a standard material with all of the options that we could possibly want. So for now, let's just change the diffuse front color here to red. So now it is a red material. If I zoom in a little bit on the image. So what we can do is, for example, let's rename this red map. Just drag and drop onto any object in the image and it will change that. But actually, let's first create another material, blue map. Do this here. We can also say select an object, and here we have the material linker. So we can either just select an image here, or a material here rather, Or again, we can take our blue map and drag and drop it into here. But let me show you a better way of working, I believe. Let's disable these materials. There we go. Make my blue map disappear. Quickly remake it. Here. Okay. So we can go into layer 3D, and we can see that if we scroll down, there is a shading tab, and there are two options: override material and shading layer. So override material, as you might imagine, is a way to pick one material and apply it to absolutely everything. A different way, however, is to use shading layers, and these are great. So if we go into our materials and right-click, new shading layer, basically what this allows us to do, similarly to how we use rules to add our objects to the geo group, we can double-click this, and this allows us to create rules for our material. So first of all, before I do anything, in my layer 3D, let me assign the shading layer, which I put here, into the shading layer slot. Apply. So now this layer 3D is using this shading layer as sort of a book in which it looks up rules for which objects, or which set of rules should have what materials applied to them. So for example, here in filter, one thing I can do is say, for example, go box, and here select the address, very much like in Windows Explorer or Linux or Macintosh, and Control C to copy this, and I can paste it here, and I can select materials red, and it will make it red because there is a rule to make it red. However, how do I, for example, apply this to other objects? So I can do underscore geo, but this doesn't work. Why? Because I need to first apply the star symbol, which means everything in geo will be red. So now this is used as a rule. But then, for example, on top, I can create a new rule. So here I can say anything sphere, and anything after will be materials blue. Oops, no it isn't. So what we have to do is select this second rule and move it. Let's see. Yep, move it to above the first, so this takes precedence. So sphere, even though it has geo, is blue as opposed to red. So the shading layers can be a great way to say, for example, type in a specific object that you have, say building, and apply one material to it, or tree, apply a different material to it, and it will select all of your trees or all of your buildings, as long as you have worked out a good naming convention system in your folder structure, which is why it's important to keep things very systematic. So here we have underscore geo for these kind of things. For lights, I might want to change the name of this to lights, and it'll be easier for me to find this later. So for example, I can go system underscore light. And this is just an easy way to work. I can, for example, create a different shading layer in which I have a different set of rules. Say, for example, I've got this rule disabled, and I can select layer 3D and plug in my other shading layer, and I get a different result. And what this allows me to do is change the materials on all of the objects without manually applying them to the objects, and this gives me a lot of versatility later on. Okay, so next up, let's look at importing objects, 3D objects, and images into Clarice and how to utilize them. So, first of all, let's go into Materials, and I'm going to File, Import, Texture, Streaming Map File, and select my bricks texture, and So if I click here, double click on it, I can see my texture. And so let's, in our red material, instead, click here to change the diffuse front color, and I click this little texture icon, and the window pops up. I go into materials and select my bricks, and this texture will be applied to everything. So that is very simple. It really takes no effort to import textures. How do you import geometry? Well, let's go into Geo. We click File, Import Geometry. If your file is OBJ, go into Geometry. However, if your file is Alembic, AVC, you should import it as Scene. So here my file is OBJ, Geometry. This, I would not like to import the OBJ materials now. And here I have my imported object. It's as simple as that. So that's it for important things. Let's actually get rid of this for now. Last couple of things to look at are very simple but very useful when working. So for example here we have a we have a render region button, and if we click it and then just draw a region of our image, it will only render whatever is selected. This is very useful when you have a big scene and you're making very small changes that you only want to see without having to load everything else. Another cool thing to do is that you can use the ruler, and basically again here we can just draw a line from one to another thing and see how far they are apart. So this is 9.5 meters. This is very good for setting the scale of your project, making sure that everything makes sense to a human scale, and it's just a nice little tool to use. So this is it for the very basics of queries. I will explain a lot of things in much more depth later on, and there will be a lot of tips and tricks that I think of as I go along, but this should be enough to get you started on just using the interface and exploring the possibilities of queries.